Hey everybody, my name's Sean. A lot of you may recognize me as Innovaspeed, specifically because of the truck behind me, my 1995 Ford F-150, otherwise called the Roadways F-150. What a lot of people don't realize is the truck's name is actually Donald, in honor of the gentleman that I inherited the truck from. Okay, so the way that I came by the truck was basically, I had driven it a few times because Donald, owned the truck from new. He had his 1970 F-100 stolen right out of the grocery store parking lot in 1995, and so he needed another vehicle. He went and paid cash for this at the dealership, brand new, right here in Phoenix, Arizona, and proceeded to drive the truck all the way until he unfortunately died of kidney failure in early 2018, at which point I, through the fortunate misfortune, I guess I call it, inherited it through the family. And then it just kind of sat around with a dead battery, and it didn't really have a purpose in the family. In fact, I tried to sell it for probably a good 3 or 4 months and never could get a fair offer on it, but I had a lot of people drive by interested, and it just sat because I didn't really want to get rid of it, but I didn't know now how to keep it. And through a few chance conversations, as all good race car conversations are, induced by alcohol, the idea that, hey, this truck maybe should be built into something came up. Naturally, living in Phoenix, there's a lot of off-road stuff here. So the initial idea was maybe make a pre-runner. But it's not really my thing. If I do off-road, I want to do dirt bikes and quads. I just never really wanted to invest in building an off-road vehicle. It wasn't me. And I come from a background of road racing and autocross, so the natural progression was, who's ever built a truck for autocross and road racing? And at the time, the truck segment was very new. This was mid-2018 when this idea was coming around. And only now, going into 2020, has the truck segment, specifically in the pro touring area, really exploded. So I guess I kind of get the fortunate bragging rights of, hey, I was one of the first. But he'd be rolling over in his grave right now if he knew that I made a truck named in his honor do what it does and look like what it looks like, because this was so not his thing. I guess once the decision was made that, okay, let me try and build a truck that handles, I knew that I couldn't have a shop do it, and so I started researching and came to the very quick realization that if you're not trying to do anything off-road, the aftermarket for these 90s F-150s, quite frankly, sucks. And it's not the aftermarket's fault, it's just the demand was never really there, right? We all knew somebody that had a truck, but we just used them as work trucks. I mean, my dad had a couple of them growing up, so I was familiar with them, but very quickly learned that if I was gonna do this, it was gonna be on my own. So then it turned to, okay, who's built a truck? Let me just get some ideas, because I didn't really know where to go with it. It was just a truck and an idea at that point, and I had a lot to learn. So I started looking around, and I came across Mark Bovey and his Target truck up in Canada. Brilliant build, wonderful guy. I reached out to him, and he answered a ton of my questions. And then Rob and Brandy out in California with the C10R. I think anybody that's ever seen a truck go fast knows that truck. And if you don't, you're missing out. It is a work of art. And then there's a lot of other people throughout the pro touring truck community, just like I said, starting to get into that realm of, I have an old truck and I want to make it handle. And so I was looking to them, and thanks to Rob McGregor with No Limit Engineering, I think he's done a lot for the truck community in general, providing a foundation for the older trucks to become this and even more. And he's pushed that for longer than probably anyone. So watching those guys really gave me a great idea of some of the pitfalls even I was in store for, but I definitely did not realize the fabrication mountain that I was gonna have to climb, because it makes Everest look like child's play. What really made it, I guess, the biggest challenge of all for me was not only the fact that there wasn't anybody building these trucks, there was no support, I didn't have photos to go off of, but I knew that it could be done, because if other people could build a truck to handle, I sure as hell could too. And a lot of my original plan was, okay, I'll adapt the kind of same strategy that all of those guys were using, and even pull from further back some of the guys back in the early days of like the Mark IV IRS swaps and stuff like that, into all kinds of vehicles. I was like, oh yeah, I'll do that. So I went and picked one up out of a junkyard, and then I thought I was going to do Crown Vic swap on the front because that's what all the truck guys were doing. That didn't cost an arm and a leg. I can't afford to have a 6-figure build. Quite frankly, I probably would have paid to somebody to build the truck in the first place if I had had that kind of budget, but I don't. And that's really how I came to fabricate anything that I own, is I had to build it all to have it all. So with the truck, I started simple, and it very quickly escalated out of control, because it was like, as I talked to people that had those suspension systems and had gone those budget-minded routes, they were very quick to point out, hey, it's good enough, but it's got its shortcomings. And the engineer brain in me, which, to be very clear, I'm not an engineer, but I did go to a little bit of college for it because I've always enjoyed those challenges. Well, I very quickly decided that it had to escalate from there, and I got too focused on those quote-unquote shortcomings and really started getting out of control with, well, how wild can I go? What's some alternative options? But the frames on these trucks are not very fabrication friendly because nothing about them is square. Every bit of the frame is at some kind of a funky angle or odd shape, and so you can't just put a square on it. And when you're building a good suspension on a vehicle that you want to go fast in, but like go where you tell it to go with the steering wheel, you can't play games with it being square. And it took me months of very, very long, frustrating days trying to get it right. And I think I got it pretty right, but I'm sure if you put it on a laser alignment rack, which I still refuse to do to this day because I just don't want to know, it's probably a little off in some places, but it works. So we'll start at the rear suspension because I think that's probably the easiest one to explain. So like I said a second ago, my original thought was use Mark 8 Lincoln independent rear suspension, which was very similar to the Terminator Cobras, which was the original independent rear suspension Mustang that everybody loves, and you've probably seen those even swapped into Fox bodies. Very cool swap. IRS is definitely a great option when given the option. So for me, when I started doing that, the problem I ran into is I'm building this now in 2018, 2019. Well, the Lincoln Mark 8's been out of production for, gosh, probably close to 2 decades, maybe more even. There's one company making bushings for it, and I'm buying parts out of a junkyard, and rubber doesn't last in Phoenix, let alone anywhere else. So I started looking at the cost of it, and I'm like, oh my God, like if I can find it, it's expensive. And it just didn't add up. And about that time, the S-550 Mustang, so the 2015 and up Mustang GTs, which were the first mass-produced Mustang with IRS, if you don't know, independent rear suspension, I should say, they were starting to pop up with their whole rear suspension systems used for really a fair price. So long story short, I did a ton of research and really dove off the deep end on that. Found out, and this is going to help some of you if you're trying to do one of these builds as well and you're looking for a budget tip. The 373 gear ratio in those diffs, that Super 8.8 is what Ford calls it, was only available in the track pack Mustangs in 2015, which were also manual transmission cars. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that track pack came with a Torsen T2R center section, which if you look that up is about $800-900 on its own. $1,100 later, I had the entire rear suspension shipped in. Now, I went crazy and replaced all the bushings with sphericals and put billet arms, and you don't have to do all that. Just replace your bushings, and you'll be pretty happy in most builds, but that's never my method, hence this thing that we have behind me. But it worked really, really well. It has made the truck handle so well. It's so nice to ride in, but it's created some suspension tuning challenges because it's still not very common to have IRS in these cars. And then moving towards the front, you know, like I said, I looked at doing the Crown Vic, and I looked at some of the builder's kits where you could like buy a front clip and graft it in, but I still wasn't very confident in my ability as a fabricator to pull that off and make it square, and the idea that I would cut my frame rails on this truck freaked me out, which in hindsight shouldn't have freaked me out. and I'll get into that more in a second. But essentially what I did is I built my own front suspension, only I did it 4.5 times, because with each version I learned something that I was doing wrong, or I found that I positioned it wrong. At version 3, I thought I had it, and I started fitting up body panels to test it one day, and my suspension was 3.5 inches too far forward. So you live and you learn. And there was definitely moments like that that really made me question, why am I doing this? Why do I keep cutting this apart and rebuilding it and spending more money on this? But it was mostly the time. I was giving up literally every spare moment I had. I didn't go out with my friends. I didn't go away for the weekend. I wasn't going on vacations. It was the truck and work. And when I was at work on lunch, I'm looking up parts or researching builds, and it took over my whole life. And I'm very glad that I did it now, but at the time, me and everyone around me was questioning my sanity, and for good reason. So for the front suspension, the end result, I essentially took a pile of tubes, and I built a square frame that I could graft under the frame. And I welded it all in and gusseted it up, and then I built my own lower control arms from scratch. I bought the Ride Tech first gen Camaro tall spindles because I needed a taller spindle that had really good aftermarket brake options and good hub options with a common bolt pattern. So I run a Mustang bolt pattern on this truck of 5x4.5. And it's worked great. It gave me a lot of wheel options that are very common, and I had a lot of good brake options, which you'll see that I went with Willwood, and ultimately that was a cost for... So as you'll see, I went with a Willwood brake kit because it was really a cost versus performance thing. I wanted a 14-inch brake, I wanted a 6-piston caliper, but I didn't have a ton of money to throw at it. And if you look it up, if you've ever researched these or you're going to research them, you'll see it's pretty much the ticket for bang for the buck in that realm. So that's what I did. And then the ball joints are kind of crazy. The bottom is an aftermarket tall ball joint for a first-gen Camaro. Fortunately, through a Circle Track supplier, I found some like cups that, the sleeves that they fit into, and I could weld them into my arm because I don't have a lathe or anything. I can't machine that. And I just wanted an off-the-shelf options. So luckily I found that. And same thing up at the upper portion of the arm. That's all Circle Track stuff. It took a lot of research. In my first version of this, it wasn't made this way, and fortunately due to the Pro Touring forums where the build is all documented, a couple of people commented and said, hey, why don't you try this? And I'm very thankful to that kind of feedback. I'm always loving that kind of feedback because that drove the front suspension into a direction that was manageable for both making it easy to fabricate and, more importantly, making it easy to tune down the line, but also repeatable side to side. It wasn't so much guesswork. It just works. And when we aligned the truck, it was a little bit different side to side, but the ultimate track width and the way the truck handles is very consistent in both directions. And that was probably more luck than skill, if I'm being very honest. For the wheels and tires, the current configuration is an Apex EC7 wheel. Quite frankly, that decision was made kind of last minute, leading up to the truck's first official event. I didn't have a lot of time. I needed something in stock, and I wanted kind of that mesh look to a wheel. So Apex offers a really, it sounds like I'm sponsored, I'm not, I promise. But truthfully, they offer one of the better wheels for track use in a common size and the Mustang bolt pattern like I needed. And also, fortunately, their offset was favorable to what I needed to do. I needed very little spacer to make it fit the truck right. I'm not a big fan of using spacers at all if I can help it. So the current configuration is an 18x10 wheel with a 285/30/18 tire on it. The truck was originally built, well, I guess still is built around a 315 squared setup. I promise the name of the channel is purely coincidental. I honestly ran out of money when it came time to have wheels made. I needed custom offsets to make that work without huge spacers, which, like I just said, I'm not comfortable running huge spacers. So eventually that's what the truck will end up on, is 315s on all four corners with an 18x11 wheel. Right now I'm kind of having fun tuning the truck on this setup, because I figure if I can make it handle really good on the 285, then the 315 is just going to be the icing on the cake. Luckily, going to the Mustang bolt pattern has opened the doors to not having to battle through finding favorable bolt patterns from wheel manufacturers. I can just tell them it's a Mustang bolt pattern, and that's the end of that discussion. One of the few easy discussions when it comes to calling and asking for aftermarket parts for such an odd application. For braking hidden inside the wheels, like I mentioned, I have a Willwood brake kit up front, so I don't like cross-jeweled rotors. Everybody can debate that however they feel. That's just my opinion. So I found 14-inch slotted rotors, two-piece rotors, I should say, from Willwood with their Aero 6-piston front calipers. It just really seemed to be, like I said, the best bang for the buck. In the rear, one of the other reasons I like the track pack setup for the F-150 independent rear suspension is because the track pack cars came with a 13.3-inch rear rotor and a fairly large single piston caliper. I thought my front to rear weight bias would be worse. So it seemed like the big single piston rear would be perfectly fine, and it does a great job. It really does. I don't get heat issues or anything like that. I don't seem to get any brake fade, although I haven't done any extended track sessions, so that remains to be proven. But overall, the bias of the system seems to work well. One of the tricks I did use there, though, is I figured out that Bear offers their remaster series of master cylinder in a bolt pattern that does indeed bolt right onto the factory brake booster for this truck. So I am running power brakes, no ABS or anything like that. Maybe one day I'd like to, but for now it's just straight up the pressure dictates the speed at which you stop. But I did get, with the remaster, they offer a proportioning valve so you can kind of alter the front to rear bias. And I haven't really had to play with it. I kind of went with their out-of-the-box settings they recommend, and so far the truck seems to do good when I actually use the brakes to their full potential. Originally, the truck came with a 5.8 or 351 Windsor, as we more commonly know it in the Ford world. And this truck specifically had the AO4D, which was, I think it's a 4-speed automatic. It was an automatic. So I did convert the truck to a manual transmission. That was a non-negotiable part of the build right from day one. Whatever happened with the truck, it was going to be a manual. I needed a third pedal. That's just my jam. So in order to do that, the logical option, because I kind of was Fox body minded, I guess, due to the era of the truck when I started, I went with a TKO 600. What I didn't know at the time is, in order to make this transmission really happy at higher RPM shifting and have the strength you really need with the bell housing, so I have run a QuickTime bell housing, stuff like that, you had to spend a little bit of money. This has the carbon synchro rings, I think it is. I don't remember the specifics. It was all done for me by Modern Driveline when I bought the transmission kit. But basically what I didn't know at the time is, when it was all said and done, I could have run the exact same clutch and flywheel setup from McLeod that I do now, which is the RST. Brilliant twin disc clutch, I have to say. I'll run it again in any other vehicle I ever build. But I was within $400-ish of having a T56 setup. So if I had to pick out a regret on the driveline, that's probably the biggest one, because the T56 probably would have been a little better option. And not for gear ratios. Honestly, the gear ratios in this transmission have been fantastic. Second gear takes me to almost 70 miles an hour at 6,500 RPM. On the highway, if I stuff it in fifth with the 373 rear gear, and I think my tire's about a 27.5-inch tire height overall, at like 78 miles an hour, I'm like 21 or 2200 RPM. So it'll lumber right down the highway. So not a gear ratio thing. The T56 is just a little more common, a little more a few more shifter options, and it's a little happier, higher RPM shifting. In front of that, I did keep the Ford motor. So Ford guys, breathe. it looks like an LS. And I get asked all the time, and it's kind of become a point of humor for me. So don't feel bad if you thought it was an LS, it's totally fine. A lot of people still don't know that Holley offers a high ram setup for the small block Fords, all of them, the 302 and the 351. So these trucks were available with 3 different motors. You could get the straight 6, you could get the 302, or you could get the 351. Luckily for me, he got the 351 because I discovered Brian Duffy here in Phoenix just by good fortune of a chance internet search one day at lunch. He builds a lot of the engines for like Cobra Kit cars, or did, and then he does a lot of really nice work. He's just a solo guy out of his shop in his backyard, but what an incredible track record, and really down-to-earth, cool guy. Not very talkative though. I wish he would talk to me more. But I'm kind of a talker, so I guess I'm biased. But he did an excellent job. He took the motor, and we compromised because the 2-bolt mains on these factory 351 Windsor motors are kind of their Achilles heel. I'm not a boost guy, so I didn't run a high ram because I want boost. I just wanted a good tunnel ram intake. This truck will never have boost, so if that's what you're here for, sorry guys. But he took us out to a 408-inch motor, so 4-inch stroke, 4-inch-ish bore. We did 20 thou over on the bore. The bores were mint. He was like, honestly, this motor is in such great condition. If it was just a rebuild, we would only hone it. We wouldn't even punch it out, but we did. Because bigger is better, right? No replacement for displacement. And so when we did that, we went to a fully forged rotating assembly. So it's a scat crank, it's a Cali's Compstar H-beam rod, and I think it's a diamond lightweight piston. The motor was built to rev and be very free to do so. It's a very happy motor to punch it. It wraps out a lot like a motorcycle, which I like, especially for heel toe downshifting. And really just in general, it sounds cool. So with that, then we went with a set of RHS as cast heads, and we have a custom ground comp cam. We do have a 1/16 lobe separation angle, so the truck sounds kind of mild for what it is, but in its current configuration, it produces about 530 horsepower on 91 octane pump gas, which was another important thing to me. I drive this truck all the time. I will literally take it to get groceries. I take it pretty much every Tuesday to get tacos because Taco Tuesday is life. So it gets driven all the time, not just on the track, and that's what we really built it for. Yeah, we could get more power out of the motor, absolutely, but it would be at the expense of the motor won't last very long, and we'd probably have to get into exotic fuels to prevent detonation with this configuration. So for the Serpentine system, you may be looking at that, and they all kind of start to look similar in layout. You can't really reinvent the wheel too much. You got to have your accessories. This one specifically, CVF, I went with them quite frankly because I met them at SEMA in 2018, which was my first visit ever there. Had a good conversation. They offered me a good deal, honestly, and I wanted a full Serpentine system. I needed it all, and that included AC, so pay attention in those rolling shots here, and you're going to see there is indeed a Sandin AC compressor. But I needed it all, and they had it all, and it could all bolt on. What we didn't know at the time, or what I didn't know, is that I had the reverse drive water pump. I guess Ford had like 6 different water pump configurations on their small block Fords, which was news to me at the time. And so to my good fortune, when I talked to CVF like a year later, when I was finally ready to start the motor, they said at first no. And then they came back and said, okay, fine, we'll make a reverse drive water pump for you. So we used my truck as the test bed for it. And to this day, it's not on their website, but if you've got a small block Ford and you want to run a CVF Raptor Serpentine kit, call them up. They'll send you the stuff. And not to sound like I'm full of myself, but you're welcome. So it's worked really, really well. Their lifetime warranty has already come in handy. My alternator went bad at one point, just stuff happens, and they replaced it, no questions asked. So thank you to CVF for really taking good care of me there, just as a customer, not even sponsored or anything like that. The rest of the motor is pretty simple. Catalog stuff is just generic tall valve covers, an intake that I put together myself through the high ram system. I was able to go to Holley Dominator EFI system. I knew I wanted the ability to expand and grow as time went on, regardless of what I did with the truck, because the whole point of this build ultimately was a way for me to really push the envelope on my skills and develop skills that I've never had, or do things that I've always been too scared to try. And I think that's been the biggest thing that's come out of this that I can relate to all of you, is that you can really do it. You just have to try. I did so many things on this truck that I was convinced I couldn't do, and actually worked great. So the beauty of running the Dominator system, though, is because these trucks were built in the 90s, everything was vacuum operated, and the sensors are all antiquated now, and they don't really connect to anything anymore. So yes, it runs an LS throttle body and it runs all LS sensors, but they work and they're common and I can get them anywhere. And honestly, it has made the process of tuning such a custom vehicle, mechanically speaking, very, very easy. Whether it be me, myself on my laptop tweaking things, or Andrew, otherwise known as Dr. EFI, working his absolute magic that I'll never thank him enough for making this truck run as good as it does. By the way, at 530 horsepower out of a small block, I just checked, I'm averaging 19.1 miles per gallon, and I don't drive this truck nice at all, only on nice days. So when it came time originally to put in the Dominator system, I got to thinking how I was going to wire the chassis, and this is a perfect example of one of those areas that I think a lot of us car guys that are mechanically minded would kind of freak out about it. Some of you are probably comfortable with it. At the time this started, if I didn't have to do wiring, I didn't screw with it. But it is very expensive to pay other people to do it, and I had kind of reached a point in the truck where I'd been attached to it for so long. It was about 16 or 17 months into the build at that point that I was like, all right, this has to be done how I want it. And then I got to looking, how could I modernize it? I like LEDs, I like modern solid state electronics, and so I got to digging. And I stumbled across another Holley brand, RacePack. Turns out, RacePack has their PDM30 SmartWire system. And so upon further investigation, I was like, oh man, this is the ticket. I gotta do this. Essentially, the simple side of that system is that it allows you to wire the entire chassis with no fuses or relays. It's all done through logic, which is largely how modern vehicles are done. So what I mean by logic in a simple example is this truck is set up to where if the water temperature is over 200 degrees and if the truck is under 45 miles an hour, then the fan will turn on, and it's progressive through what's called PWM, or pulse width modulation, and essentially it's a high frequency pulse of the ground signal, and that's how it regulates the output of the motor. And it can get more complicated from there, but most people it goes over their head. It still kind of does with me. Just know the Dominator and the SmartWire systems can handle that type of deal, and you really can't do it with any other system. So through that SmartWire system, it also allowed me to utilize stock style lighting. What I mean by that is, for example, in the rear, the stock lights are a dual filament bulb. But I had to get kind of creative with the logic that, honestly, my conversations, I had 2 or 3 conversations with RacePack about this. They told me I couldn't do it. Never to be one told that I can't do it. A truck that handles, see a theme here? I did figure it out through the logic, and it's got full brake light, tail light, running light, and turn signals, hazards, all of it right through the SmartWire system. And it's all with LED and HID lighting, even in the headlights. For those of you that are wondering, I get a lot of questions about the lighting on the truck, by the way. These are just eBay specials. I was just extremely picky about which version I used. Luckily for me, China came through in this instance, and they seem to have made a quality product, but we'll see how they stand the test of time. Nonetheless, the SmartWire is tied into everything on the truck, and what the SmartWire doesn't handle, the Dominator does. And so even the Vintage Air AC and heating system runs through there, and it has really made my life easy. If you're having circuit faults or something isn't coming on when it should, it's as simple as hooking up the laptop, popping open the program, and going and clicking on that circuit and just seeing the data stream, which sounds scarier than what it is, and it's really not. And I would totally do this system again. To be fair, it is not cheap, and I really questioned why I was spending that much money at the time. But when you have something this custom, this so one-off, and with nobody that's willing to really try and understand to support it, that was everything to be able to change things on the fly without having to make drastic changes in the physical sense of moving fuses and relays around and totally rewiring stuff. This has been a godsend, quite honestly. So thanks to the Dominator and SmartWire systems, I can use all of their CAN bus data to run the CAN bus keypad, which is all my startup and lighting and all that stuff, and then also the CAN bus analog gauges and digital dash through the Dominator. So I have everything I need right there, and I can add or subtract anything I want at any given time. It's been wonderful. To touch on the question of why do I have the analog gauges with the digital dash, it's for this reason. For me, mentally, I can see where a needle is and instantly understand what that value is, but if I see a digital number that's moving like RPM, it takes me a split second to think about it, and that's a split second I'm not thinking about driving. When you're in race conditions, I do think that matters, even at amateur motorsports like what I do. So the cool thing is, I was able to create a really nice dash layout that's very easy to understand. Everything's right where I need it. It does look like carbon fiber. I'll throw myself under the bus. It's just 1/8 inch aluminum sheet that I formed to fit within the roll cage that I built in the cab, just because it was simple. I was originally thinking about using the factory dash, but it's big, bulky, there wasn't a good way to hook up the vent system, and it just became too frustrating to mount everything. So I scratched that, went to a lightweight aluminum dash. There probably wasn't really any weight savings there, but as you can see, it looks awesome, I think. And like I said, it puts everything right where I need / want it. So the nice thing is then you see the steering column. That woodwork column is such a work of art. That was another piece that I saw in the Target truck, and then also this is the one that NASCAR uses. I needed a quick release, I needed a collapsible steering column, and I needed a common spline on both ends. This kind of fit the bill there, and honestly, everything I've ever bought Woodward is just awesome. Great little company to deal with. They just make good parts, and they're very, very, very friendly to deal with. And also, they get stuff out to you right away. And then I use an NRG steering wheel on that. Really, any of these 6-bolt aftermarket steering wheels will do the job. Pick your brand. This just happened to be what I laid my hands on for a good deal, and it fits the look of the truck, I think. Now behind that, I'm using Sparco Evo 2 US seats. The US is, for those of us true Americans, they got a little extra girth. But the seats are pretty snug, and if you're over a certain weight, you're not going to want to sit in this truck, and so it kind of keeps me honest. But at the end of the day, I needed a good fixed back racing seat to fit in this cab. There's not a lot of room in a single cab, and the factory cloth bench seats just aren't really meant for performance. It's more for cruising, and yeah, I cruise in this truck, and the Sparcos are surprisingly comfortable for that. When you start making grip and throwing it in a corner in an autocross or on a track, and you start sliding around, that's when you find out what a core workout is. This way, I use my G-Force 6-point belts to hold me snug in those seats, and I'm not going anywhere. But that also leads me to why I built a cage. I didn't want a super complicated full-on road race cage or anything like that because I use it on the street, so it was important that I have a cage, because if you've ever seen a wreck of one of these trucks, they're about the equivalent of a beer can. And so when I threw this much power at it, I knew the speeds were going to get pretty fast, pretty quick. And I just wanted something a little extra there, and also made it easier to mount harnesses and mirrors and dashes and stuff. So it all kind of worked out in the end. So it's a basic 8-point cage with 4 of the points being removable in this version of the truck. Down the line, that will go away as things become more radical. But for now, this very simple cage that I did design and build right here works great. I did have experience building roll cages prior to this. I used to build BMW track cars, so this wasn't new to me, and that is one area where I'll say if you don't really know what you're doing and you want your cage to be safe, you should probably bite the bullet and get help if you don't know what you're doing. But luckily for me, I had experience, it worked, it's out of the way, I don't hit my head on it, and there's no tubes in my way should the unfortunate occurrence of an accident happen. So ultimately, there is some things in the interior that I have to finish, but at the end of the day, it's extremely usable as it is now, and it does everything I need it to do. I'm just finally now getting into the phase of the truck where I can start putting those finishing touches and making cover panels for everything and really kind of dressing it up. Now for the interior, everybody walks up and they think it's a first-gen Lightning, and that's okay. You're justified in doing that. This truck, just by sheer good fortune, I guess, the way it came from the factory was as close as you could get to a Lightning without being a Lightning, and that's just because Don wasn't a performance guy. He didn't really care about cars. He just wanted a great little truck that would work. I got lucky, I guess we would say. So yes, it looks like a first gen Lightning, and that's because it might as well be from a body standpoint. It shares all the panels. For the black handles and stuff, those are Lightning parts that I ordered as new replacement parts. But in the early photos of the truck, for any of you that have followed this thing along online, or you look it up as the Road Race F-150 or however you want to search it, you'll notice it was originally that classic two-tone 90s paint of the cream white surrounded by a random kind of average color, in this case burgundy. If the paint had been in better shape, I'd have kept it and gone with it and taking better care of it throughout the fabrication process, but it was rough. The clear coat was screwed. It had dents and dings from being used. So I beat out some of the dents as best I could, didn't waste a lot of time with body work, hit some of the bad clear coat spots with sandpaper, and threw a really high quality wrap on it. It didn't hide any of the blemishes, but at least it made it all one color. And the blue ended up being better than I thought it would be. I wanted to do like a crazy 80s, 90s neon color scheme when I went to go order the stuff, thanks to that COVID pandemic that screwed all of us car builder guys on getting stuff. I couldn't even get it. And then I talked to the wrap company, and they're like, well, you live in Arizona, the UV is going to kill the color on a bright neon wrap. We really recommend going with something else. So that's kind of how the blue was born. The blue is always going to be there. This is just a royal blue, straight up, simple wrap that I threw down. It's Avery Dennison, not 3M, if you're curious. But yeah, so it worked out. It made the truck all one color. Eventually, I'll take the wrap off, body work it, and really paint it so it's nice. But you know, honestly, for a truck that you're going to be on, it's nice to know if I ruin the wrap, I'm not scratching paint and I can just replace that piece of wrap. It doesn't have a rear bumper right now. That's because I didn't want to do a roll pan. I wanted to do a rear diffuser. And in the front, if you're looking at that front bumper and scratching your head, it's not the one that came on this truck. This is from a 2010 F-250. It's kind of a common swap, but not everybody recognizes it. And that's because I finished it out with some cover panels, so it looked more proper for the truck, and it was also aerodynamically more efficient. I have a bunch of aluminum ductwork in the front end through the radiators and coolers. I have a power steering cooler and oil cooler, as well as the AC condenser, and then the big 4-row radiator. All that needed ductwork to be more efficient. And then on the hood, you see the track spec Motorsports hood vents. I knew them from the BMW world. They're just too easy to put vents in. So overall, it made the truck look mean, but it's going to get a full diffuser, a full front splitter and under tray. And well, I'll share this with you guys for the first time here. I'm really strongly considering going full flat bottom because, hey, why not make your garage / backyard built truck have a full aerodynamic flat bottom? It just seemed like the thing to do. So we've got more to go on the truck, but for now, it still gets the looks that I always hoped it would be as a builder, and I look forward to driving it every time I walk outside. So one of the things that always inevitably comes up with trucks that is kind of a fun one to talk about, and to be clear, this truck has all original sheet metal, but I've cut some stuff away on the inside that I deemed unnecessary in the interest of removing weight. So these trucks originally start off around 4,200 pounds, depending on their spec. I didn't have any scales at the time I started. I wish I could have weighed it before so I could really know the true weight savings, but clearing out the twin I-beams and stuff saves sometimes up to 300 pounds. It's fairly significant. This truck in its current configuration with about 3/4 of a tank of fuel sits right around 3,600 pounds. The more important thing is this truck is only a 54%, it only has 54% of the weight on the front axle. So it's a 54-46 front to rear split. That's pretty good for a truck and better than a lot of the older cars if you look it up. So I'm very proud of that. Part of that is thanks to the fact that the engines in these trucks, cylinder number 1 is actually at the front axle center line from the factory. Now I went a little crazier and I moved in just the middle of my firewall just a bit to make it easier to access bolts in the back of the intake that has sensors and stuff. I didn't have to modify the firewall, but I felt compelled to for ease of maintenance later. But that's all I had to do to get the engine back about 3.5 to 4 inches, and I moved it down in the truck about 2.5, but I had to be careful because I've got that deep and wide 7-quart Canton road racing oil pan. You know, I'm trying to do the best I can. I didn't really have the budget for dry sump, and for this motor, I didn't really want to go dry sump, quite honestly. So with the engine that far back, that falls under the principle of suspension theory, if you will, that you want as much weight between the axles as you can, more specifically in between the shocks. So a lot of people get kind of confused and even scratch their head about why did I raise the fuel cell up a little bit to move it in front of the back axle. That's exactly why. You want as much weight in there as you can. And you can look it up, do all the research you can, or debate me, and that's fine too. A lot of people already have. But it's worked great because you don't have that 250 plus pounds of fuel cell and fuel load sloshing around behind your back axle, doing a lot like a Porsche does with the rear engine configuration, pulling the rear end around. So this truck handles extremely neutral for what it is, and it didn't hurt my weight biases all, as you can tell. So I'm very happy about how that worked out. This fuel cell, this fuel-safe fuel cell, houses a single Aeromotive 340 fuel pump, which is powered off of the multi-speed pulse width modulation, like I mentioned earlier, with the solid-state electronics. And it's in tank, so it keeps the pump cool. You don't really hear it except for when you first turn the truck on to start it. Once the truck's running, you can't hear the fuel pump. It's super quiet. I don't get my fuel overheating or anything. So it doesn't quite hold a full true 16 gallons of fuel though once you add all the foam and crap that's in this thing. But the nice thing is I don't get fuel slosh. I've run it as low as about 1/8 of a tank in autocross and not having any fuel starve issues. But it does have a trapdoor sump in there. So it all worked out in the end. I don't mind that every 5 years I have to replace the bladder. I think it's only about 150 bucks. And there's also a certain element to the safety of it there. Like I keep a Howland fire extinguisher in here, like the FAA recommends for small commuter planes and stuff, because it doesn't damage electronics. So by the way, if you're running a household fire extinguisher in your race car, stop that, go get a Howland one. It's expensive, but you have a chance to recover from it. Same thing with the fuel cell. I didn't, if it got away from me or anything like that, I don't worry about having fuel leaking everywhere. So a lot of the truck was built with kind of, if I screw something up or I screw up when driving, I'm not gonna totally get hosed on that. Also, in the interest of weight, I didn't build much of an exhaust. I had to kind of find a balance there. Had the worst time finding headers that would fit these heads with this minimal of ground clearance and frame clearance. So these are American Racing 1 7/8 primary headers into a 3-inch collector, but I had to modify where 3 of the primaries route in order to get it to clear everything right. And then from there, I built my own exhaust off of a Flowmaster builder's kit. It's all 304 stainless, TIG welded by me, right at home in my backyard. Originally, I was running hush power mufflers. It was too quiet. I wanted it to make a little more noise. So I went to a Berea drag muffler, but I was blowing sound at all the tracks, which unfortunately, for some reason now, are all cracking down on their sound regulation. So currently, these are Borla XR1 Sportsman mufflers. With a turn down that I made myself, and I am doing right at 93 decibels at roughly 50 feet out at full tilt, and so I'm passing sound regs, and the truck definitely still sounds the part. The biggest thing at this point with the truck as I move forward in its evolution is I'm still going to leave everything basically in this configuration. Eventually I would like to move up from the RideTech single adjustable coilovers that I have now, which, if you're wondering, I have 800 pound per inch spring rate up front and 550 rear. I do have much heavier sway bars all the way around. But more specifically, I'm focusing on aerodynamics of the truck, hence the hood vents and stuff like that. It is going to get a rear wing. It definitely needs a front splitter, and even more importantly, really needs a rear diffuser. And it's not just because I want the truck to say race car, I do, but also because it's a truck and it's a little higher off the ground, it is getting a little unstable above 100 miles an hour. I have had the truck as fast as 132, and you can feel that it's not planted as much as I'm used to with the car world. So it's going to get a wing. It needs a bed cover to clean up the air back there, and I really think I'm going to do a flat bottom at some point. Because there's just a lot to be gained there, and I can really kind of artificially lower the truck that way by speeding up the air. And I think that's going to do a lot to really plant it, because I've used autocrosses to really dial in the truck in its basic form while keeping the speeds in check. But that road course bug is really starting to gnaw at me, and you are going to see this truck start popping up on actual road courses soon. And that's really where, as we all know in this amateur motorsports arena, aerodynamics become everything. And I think that's important to try and beat some more of those misnomers that a truck can't be aerodynamically efficient. Just you watch. I love everything about this thing because it represents the best of my fabrication ability thus far. And it's led me into meeting so many of you and others that I would have never met any other way. And so many people have come through to help me. My neighbor, Brian Klim, my best friend, Tanner Buck, giving me time whenever they could spare it. You know, Lance Hamilton, God, that guy has given me so much help across the build and just advice and being a sounding board. And then Jesse over at Level 7 Motorsports. Thank you guys for all the wiring help. I don't know how I'll ever repay him, and really the whole Pro Touring community. You guys have made me love this truck even more than I have, just as a symbol of what I accomplished. The question always comes up, would I sell it or is it a family heirloom? Yeah, I'd sell it for the right price, but I'll tell you this, the right price is probably quite a bit higher than anybody would ever reasonably pay for this. That's okay. That means it gets to stick around and it'll just evolve more and more and more over time. And that also is going to let me take it to a lot more events and do a lot more with it, and me grow as a driver and a fabricator as this continues. Hell, I may even take it, and I'm seriously tempted at some point to just go full tube chassis and go nuts. You never know with me. I sometimes jump off the deep end, but seriously, the whole community, all of you have made this by far and above the best experience I never could have dreamed of when I first took off that first bolt in October of 2018. It has been really fun taking the truck out and about now that it's done. That whole 18 months that I was just grinding every night to get it done, we're just over 2 years total now from the start to where we sit today. But I think everybody can kind of relate to it, because at the end of the day, even if you're a Chevy or Dodge guy, everybody knew at least one person with one of these trucks in the 90s. My dad, having had a couple, he had girlfriends that had them, I remember growing up. I think everybody really relates to it, and then the fact that there's still, even at this point, just isn't anybody really doing this. I know of one other radical build like this with this particular 9th gen F-150. They're just so rare. It's awesome. Even the guys at events that are hardcore Chevy guys will come up and tell me that, and then say, but hey, it's still a cool truck. And I think at the end of the day, when you put your heart and soul, blood, sweat, and tears, and yes, tears, into this truck, that means more than any other thing you can get next to the just flat out enjoyment of driving it. But, you know, lending to that, and as a reminder to what I went through to get here, there's actually a dent in the passenger side, top of the bedside. That was kind of the pinnacle of my frustration. I took a 30-pound load leveler from an engine hoist to the head one night when I was working on the truck. It had been there for 2 or 3 months and randomly fell down as I walked by. And that was right after I just discovered for the 3rd or 4th time that my front suspension geometry was wrong and in the wrong place. And so I kind of leave that dent at this point to remind me what I went through to get here. So I always like to point that out to people, that those little things are there. It's not a perfect truck, but it perfectly embodies me and what I was wanting to accomplish.